Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. I'm Elizabeth Corey, and I'm the founder of beatingtrauma.com. And we are here today to have another discussion about trauma and how it impacts us in our lives. And today, in particular, I want to talk about this idea that I'm calling the cycle of impossible standards. Now, I don't know about you, but I have lived for way too long with this cycle. Not so much anymore, but it's an extremely difficult cycle to break ourselves out of. And it can be a difficult cycle to even see it at all. And once we do see it, then that does assist us in breaking out of it. But it's a tough one because two of the most powerful parts in the system are involved in this sort of cycle standoff experience that I'm going to talk about today. So it's intense, and it comes with a whole lot of things actually going on behind the scenes. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about this cycle of impossible standards, and you may relate to some of this, and you also may not, but I find that a lot of trauma survivors really do this to themselves. Like, the impossible standards is such a big, big part of our lives. Some people who don't know much about trauma will sometimes say to me, "Oh, you work with trauma survivors? Are these people like homeless, or are they, struggling to, get out of addictions, and are they completely unproductive?" I'm like, no. A lot of the trauma survivors I work with are doing so much in the world, right? They are just incredibly productive, very perfectionistic, over the top in almost everything that they do, doing it to the T, right? I don't know if this may sound familiar to you, but they are definitely not at rock bottom. They just feel like they're rock bottom, right? So it isn't this idea that trauma survivors are struggling in the world is just, yes, some do, and it's understandable that they do, but it's not the full picture. So I'm here today to talk to those of you who feel like you may have invented a new level of perfectionism in your life, and that it is an unsustainable experience that you are in, totally exhausting. I used to feel like I was running a marathon every day. But people on the outside were like, "Oh, look how successful she is." I felt horrible. So today, I'm going to discuss with you this cycle, which, while on one level, we have to give kudos to the controller, who has done an amazing job of making us look okay in a world that really has made it clear that they don't want to hear about our problems. That said, it has led to a lot of internal torture. So we're going to talk about this today. And Carol is saying, "Just a time while I clean my car to sell." Yes, so, take it to a certain level, right? And then that's probably enough, right? That's a big part of what we need to learn. So I want to also say hi to Jan. Thank you guys for being here. So let's talk about this cycle. I actually came up with steps. Are these the only steps? No, but this seemed like the easiest way to talk about the cycle. So I'm going to start off with step number one. And step number one is that because we are growing up in an abusive environment, right? A traumatic environment, the shame builds up in our system as we end up getting blamed for almost everything in our childhood. And of course, most 99% of what we're blamed for, we have absolutely nothing to do with or no control over it whatsoever, right? So we may have been blamed for people's emotions. We may have been blamed for tornadoes in other states. I know, that's not random. All these things we're blamed for. So the shame starts to build up in the system. It's an important note to remember that shame in and of itself is not actually true. It's never true. It's actually the only emotion that isn't true. Okay? And by that I mean, you might be thinking, well, this futility I feel or this anger I feel doesn't feel true in the moment. and hopefully it doesn't to you. And it's really not in the moment, but it's true based on what actually happened to you. Shame is always a lie. So when we are blamed for everything, it's because the people in our childhood didn't want to take on the shame. Like, they already have it, but they don't want to acknowledge the shame of the mistakes that they're making. So they just put that on you, right? So we end up with all this shame, this projected shame on us. Okay, so the next step is that the futility starts to build in our system. And that is fueled by this shame. So most futility, not all, but most futility, and definitely the futility that the karma kid holds, is fueled by shame. What that means, I'll give you an example because it can be hard to sort of picture this. Like, think about shame and what it says in our system. It says, in the shortest possible way, you're not good enough, right? Like that's sort of what shame is telling us. You're not good enough. Okay. It says a lot more than that, but we're just going to stick with this for this example. Futility says, what's the point? What's the point? So that what's the point develops because of you're not good enough, right? So this is the message that starts building in our system. If we hear that it's our fault or we're not good enough long enough, we start to then develop the futility that says, well, what's the point? Because clearly I'm not good enough. So that means that nothing's really going to work out in my life. It's all just going to be a mess because I'm not good enough. So like, how could it work out if I'm not good enough? So this is sort of the cycle we develop. And usually by the time, if we're growing up in a traumatic environment, by the time we get to be about 11, 12, 13 years old, this is running like a circle all day long in our system. It's like a wheel, right? You know, like we're talking about breaking the cycle, right? Like we've got, the wheel is turning, right? Now, after those sort of get in place and they start spinning around inside of us, the karma kid is just getting stronger and stronger and stronger. The controller, okay, becomes more and more panicked because they're also getting messages like, let's say, from schools or from, parents, depending on what their particular, expectations are for us. They're getting these messages that we have to do better. And it can feel really confusing because on one side it's saying you're not good enough, and on another side it's saying you better be perfect, right? Or at least you better be really, really good. But sometimes it is saying you better be perfect. So the controller is panicking because they're taking on all of these messages that they have to succeed in this world. They have to look like everybody else who is succeeding in this world. But they also have all these ungrounded emotions saying that's impossible at the same time. So the controller panic just kind of grows and grows and grows. And if you grew up with anxiety like I did, then you know how that feels in your system. So now the controller is like, what do I do about this? I got to succeed. I got to show that I can do this. I got to make somebody happy out there. I don't know who, but I got to figure it out. So they choose to block these emotions, and they have a lot of ways, a lot of things they do, but they need to block these emotions so that they can begin to put into place a plan or a process or a series of actions that will counter those emotions. Like, okay, it's like, I know I have all these feelings, but I have to do the opposite of what they say. Okay, so this is what the controller is thinking. So they start to use what I refer to as survival skills. And all of our parts use survival skills. They use survival mechanisms. The controller's survival mechanisms will often, but not always, look like things like perfectionism, right? Hypervigilance, right? Always watching the environment for even the smallest of changes. They will force things. So there's this sort of desperate forcing that happens with the controller. They will have this really manic energy where it's like never slowing down, always pushing, just get another thing done, Their goal is to make life look different than what those emotions under the surface are saying it's gonna look like, okay? So that's what the controller is trying to do. in the process, they begin to develop very, very high standards because, it's something that my controller tells my kids all the time. I'm always like, leave wiggle room, leave wiggle room for things to go wrong. And when I talk about this with them, I'm talking about their grades because my controller is still really partial to good grades. That's been one of those areas I'm still struggling to totally let go. So I will say to my kids, I'll be like, make sure you leave a little wiggle room because, if your grade is high enough, one bad test isn't going to throw you off completely, but if your grade is on the verge, one bad test could really cause you some problems. So this is a message I give them, and it's so controller. It's the epitome of controller when I say that to them. But the high standards are because the controller knows underneath the surface there's a big mess. And so they're like, if I can keep everything up to like a certain level of perfection, when those bad things inevitably happen, it will only take us down so far, right? So there's really, we want to have that wiggle room. We don't want to be taking a lot of risks. We don't want to be, pushing the limits of what we can have or accomplish in the world, but we want to do everything we do that we choose to do as perfect as possible. So it's like, I don't want to take on anything risky because then I can't get it perfect, right? I don't want to take on anything that's unpredictable because then I can't get it perfect, right? So this is another way the controller behaves. So they have very high standards for what they do, but to be fair, they don't always take on a lot of the things that are actually probably most exciting and purposeful to us. They will reject those things because their ultimate goal is avoid failure. Now, as you may have guessed already, failure is a bit of a subjective term. As a matter of fact, it's a very subjective term. And depending on the part that is active at any given moment, failure may look very different, or you may have different parts that interpret things as failures, while other parts do not. As a matter of fact, the controller and the karma kid are going to be very quick to call something a failure, even if your adult self, knows that it's not a failure. So it's important to recognize that the term failure is highly subjective and probably internally interpreted in different ways depending on the part. So we got this controller trying to avoid failure. They're trying to keep us perfect. They're trying to make sure that nothing unpredictable or bad or risky ever happens to us because they know that they're walking along this line and right underneath it is a huge storm that is brewing and spinning and just waiting, right? Waiting its turn. But because of the approach this controller is taking, there will be some level of failure that is absolutely inevitable because the controller's approaches are unreasonable from a standpoint of standards, right? We actually can't be perfect. We're never going to be perfect. That's not really a thing. That's not like a human thing to be. We can't do it. So what ends up happening is some form of failure happens. Now, that might not be like, a particularly serious failure. It might be a small failure. But as soon as the karma kid gets the sense that failure is happening, they will be triggered forward. Okay? Which is the whole thing the controller is actually trying to avoid in the first place. But they will be triggered forward. The shame and futility attack will begin, right? We'll move into this cycle, this like the spin I was talking about, like a hurricane. I live in Florida, so hurricanes. That starts spinning and it starts coming to the surface. And there will be a point where the controller can no longer hold it back. And it usually comes with a failure trigger. Again, failure subjective. You may think this is definitely not a failure, but your karma kid is telling you something else. So that futility and shame cycle starts attacking. It can look an awful lot like depression when it hits. And this is why so many people talk about they move from this sort of manic hypervigilance energy over here to this depressive can't get off the couch energy over here, right? That's the parts. Controller, karma kid, controller, karma kid. And this is the cycle I'm talking about of completely unreasonable expectations and standards that we have for ourselves, and probably a pretty loose interpretation of what failure is. I'll be honest, it's probably not super realistic. Like, I had my karma kid tell me the other day that I ruined my entire vacation because I took a wrong turn during a walk one of the days. Obviously not actually a failure, but that's what was going on in my system, trying to make me feel bad, trying to ruin the vacation. It did not work. I caught it. I wrote from it. But it was there. And obviously, I would never, on a conscious level, think of making a wrong turn on a walk as a failure. But that is the way my karma kid kind of came at me in that moment. So, the bottom line with this cycle is that we cannot prove ourselves wrong. Okay? And this is something the controller doesn't get. So, what I like to say is this kind of work that we do with this cycle is actually meant to set the controller up for success. Because when the controller is in this state of like manic energy, perfectionism, hypervigilance, forcing things, desperation, right? It's this desperate feeling. When they're in that place, they're trying to avoid the karma kid being right. But the problem is that the karma kid is there, and the karma kid feels the way they feel. And we can't change that until we hear from the karma kid. So the controller can attempt to find external ways of proving yourself wrong over and over and over again. But it's not ever going to work, not fully. You might get a temporary success there, but it won't work for good. The only way we can change the pattern and change the cycle for good is to like break out of this controller karma kid pattern. And I'm going to talk about how we do that now so that the controller can start to be successful. Because I'll tell you what, most of our controllers are just chomping at the bit to be successful. They want it. They want it bad. They're ready for it. But they just can't figure out how to get past the karma kid. So as we process the karma kid and the controller comes down out of that really desperate state, they can start to experience success, real success. And that's a beautiful thing for the controller. Even though they fight us really hard on doing this work, we can help them out. We can help them out as the adult self. We can make a big difference for them. So let's talk about how we break this cycle. The first one is the first most important step in so many ways is to step out of the manic activity of the controller. It is very easy to get sucked into this activity. There's so much of it available to us around every corner. There is always something the controller can distract us with. There's always something we can be doing. It's one of the reasons most of us don't find our way to this journey of healing in our 20s, especially because our energy is still really high and there is plenty to do. Like this world does not, what's the best way? It definitely provides us with lots of opportunity to be busy, right? And society's expectations are for us to be busy. So it's very easy to be in this cycle. So the thing we've got to do is we've got to become aware of how we're running, and start to step out of that running. Okay. To do that, it does help to write from the controller's fears that are kind of keeping us in this constant survival skill mode, this constant survival mechanism journey. As we come out of the controller's fears, that's going to help us just to slow down even just a little bit. Just a little bit of slowing down is so incredibly helpful here. But what do those controller's fears sound like? It could be almost anything related to perfectionism and hypervigilance, but it's probably going to sound something like, we can't take our eye off the ball. You know, the other shoe will drop. We need to stay on top of things all the time. We need to keep pushing. We need to stay ahead of the game. We need to keep ourselves going. Like all of that stuff, that's all kind of the controller messaging, and we can write from that. A lot of times the controller will try to sound logical, and they do, like we think they're logical because we're used to that particular logic, but really it's a whole lot of fear. So the more we write from it, the more we can see that. And then we can start to take a step back out of that fear-based way of living in the world. So as we slow down, again, even just a little bit, the karma kid futility and shame will start to show up. Now, you may be thinking, why in the world would I want the futility and shame to show up? And that's probably your controller talking, and that's totally normal. But if we do not let them show up, if we do not actually answer the door and hear what they have to say, they are never going anywhere. We will live out the rest of our lives with this futility and shame under the surface until we hear from it. It's kind of like being followed around by a bunch of little kids who are going, hey, I need something to tell you. I need to tell you this. Hey, right? That's what it's like. And until we hear them, they're just going to sit back there and do that same thing over and over and over again. The controller's attempts to suppress them for life are generally unsustainable. Also, it will lead us to continue our traumatic patterns when we don't have to, right? I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying that it does lead to an easier life. That I can say. There's plenty of challenges. Life's full of them. But it doesn't have to be this constant traumatic crisis mode that oftentimes we are living in after trauma. So we write from these emotions. We hear from the futility. We hear from the shame. As I said earlier, there are some really key words that we can start with if we're struggling to hear from the futility and shame. For the shame example I gave earlier is, like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. Like, I don't deserve any nice things, whatever it sounds like. But the futility will often show up first. And so if you're feeling lethargic and you can't get off the couch and the controller's driving you crazy in your mind by saying we need to do this, write from what's the point. It's my favorite go-to writing prompt for Karma Kid. It's usually where Karma Kid starts with their expression. And I can tell you, because there's not a lot of people out there that will tell you there's anything you can do about depression other than medication. Medication is fine. That is great. That gets us from point A to point B. But if we want to move that futility out, like like gone, we got to express it. So writing from what's the point has been my secret saving grace. It's not secret though, because I tell you guys all the time. But it is the thing that has changed so much about my life. What's the point? Because that lethargic blah feeling is telling us something. We just don't know it's telling us something because the controller is usually screaming over it about all the things we're supposed to be doing instead. So right from the controller, but then right from that futility. And as it shows up, right from the shame. I'm not good enough. Let that right. As you do this in somewhat of a cycle, it's like controller, futility, shame, controller, futility, shame. Yeah, it may actually kind of go in that little circle. Although I will add in that oftentimes anger shows up the more that we do it. So we've got sort of all four of that going around. But as you process these feelings, the controller can start to calm down because they're not having to suppress so much stuff anymore, right? And the Karma Kid starts to kind of get less and less inundated with all these horrible feelings, and the cycle can break. And most importantly, we can start to give these parts some compassion because the adult self has just a little bit of room to step forward and give these parts some compassion for what was not ever their fault. Like the controller never wanted to be this crazy manic perfectionist hypervigilant survival skill agitated anxiety mess. That's not what they wanted. They were always meant to be productive and do really cool things. It's just they're trying to do it with all of this trauma underneath. The karma kid was never supposed to be filled with futility and shame. As a matter of fact, as a grounded part, they carry a tremendous amount of compassion. Actually, as we write from it, the compassion starts to show up a little more easily because they hold it. The problem was in childhood, that compassion got turned around and became loyalty towards somebody else, somebody who was not a good person, who wanted to put all their stuff on us. Okay? So as we write from these parts and we heal these parts, we can show them compassion, which makes them heal more, and we start a new cycle, right? And this is a good cycle. This is like I was saying, controller, karma kid futility, karma kid shame, maybe some mean kid anger. But in that, we can bring in some grounded adult self-compassion, right? And that makes this cycle of healing speed up, go maybe even a little bit faster, maybe bring us to a more grounded state more quickly because we are showing these parts compassion instead of constantly fighting with them, which is usually, no, always, another part that's doing that fighting. Excuse me. So this is what I have for you today. I hope you found this helpful. I know I was throwing a lot at you, but just think about it. When you are in your daily life and you feel yourself holding yourself to this just impossible standards, step out of them for just a minute and go, where's this impossible standard coming from, right? What can I write from here? What kind of desperate parts energy can I connect with so that I can just, give myself a little bit of compassion and take myself out of that impossible standard cycle that I really don't need. So if that's what you take from this, that is enough. That is so much. That's brilliant. Just noticing that is a trauma response and that your controller is currently desperate is so beneficial for us. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you for being here and hearing what I have to say. It takes a lot of bravery and courage to hear this stuff. It's not easy. Most people will roll through their entire lives feeling pretty darn bad and never really take the covers off this because it just feels so scary. So you guys are amazing for being here and hearing me out. And I look forward to talking to you guys next Tuesday, same time, same place, about another trauma topic. So thank you all so much. I will see you then. Bye.